Class. The topic for today, continuing in the laws of Kriyas Torah, the laws of reading the Torah during the regular weekday reading. Even we touched a little bit on some of the laws for Shabbos and Yom Tov. We are continuing with weekday stuff, and we are in Siman Kuf Lamed Hey, and we are in chapter 135. And we are in Seif Vav. We are in halacha number 6. So we were just previously talking in number 5 about not jumping over the Kohen. Okay? So we said that if it's one of those days, that if you need it, but only if he's busy reading the Shema, right? But it's better that he leaves. Now, let's say a Kohen comes to shul. Let's say he's coming for the second minyan. The first minyan, right, is at 6:30. This guy's coming for the 8 o'clock minyan. But the Kohen comes into the shul a little early, and a regular Jew has been called up for the first aliyah. Okay? So if a Kohen comes in at that time, so the Chaber says is that they've started to say the blessing of Berurah Torah. He continues on with the reading. However, if you just said Baruch Hu, that's not the beginning of it. And the Jewish person, the regular Yisrael, will stand there at the teva, okay, or the bima as we like to call it, until the Kohen and the Levi will say their blessings, and then he's going to get his slot at number 3. And if there is no Kohen in the shul, then a Yisrael gets called instead of the Kohen, and then you shouldn't have the second one be a Levi. However, the Ramah adds, the Levi could be called first, okay? And when you call him up, you say, Bimakom Kohen, in the place of a Kohen, so no one should entertain the thought that this guy is a Kohen. Okay, so the Mishnah Berurah explains, when we say that he started, he says the words Baruch Atah Hashem. That's the starting of it. But as we see afterwards, saying Baruch Hu is not starting it, and therefore you could continue with the Kohen saying the bracha. Okay, but when we say he doesn't pause, in order that it should not be a blessing said in vain, meaning the blessing is recited, as we learned earlier, over reciting the aliyah from the Torah. Okay, that's what the blessing is for. And you should recite the words. And furthermore, it should also not be considered some type of dishonor to the lineage of the Kohen, because they're going to say, oh, the Kohen wasn't there. Okay, that's what they called him. Okay? Or maybe, oopsies, we didn't realize the Kohen was there. So it makes sense to say that if it's on Shabbos, then the Yisrael, who's called in the first position, counts towards the 7, even when a Kohen walks in later, and you don't have to call the Kohen after him towards the 7 aliyahs you're required to do on Shabbos. And that's even if the Kohen was there and it was an oopsie, and they called the Yisrael instead. Okay? And so, therefore, if you summon the Yisrael as number 1, he counts towards the 7 you're supposed to call on Shabbos anyway. Okay? And then you shouldn't call the Kohen after that, and then no more Kohanim gets called. You could call a Kohen for Maftir. The Mishnah Berurah said it, I'm just telling you that. So just saying Baruch Hu is not considered starting, because the Baruch Hu is not in vain. Okay? Because the whole congregation will answer Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Va'ed. And nonetheless, the Kohen they'll say it, Baruch Hu. And then the Kohen says, Baruch Hashem Avarach, right? And then everyone says, Baruch Hashem, right? And that's fine. You can do that. And that would work. And then the Yisrael just stays there. He stays in what we have to call the pole position. He'll stand right next to the Gabbai and just wait there until the third one. So that way he should be embarrassed. However, if you call Yisrael first, don't call Levi after him. Because since Yisrael was called first, if you get a Levi, people are going to think the first guy was a Kohen. Okay? And so therefore people shouldn't make an oopsie after the fact. Okay, so that's why they just wouldn't see him up there, because people are coming in and out the whole time, and so we don't want them to think that was first guy was a Kohen. But the Levi we see can go first. Why? Because he's not any worse than being a Yisrael. And that's only assuming there's no Yisrael greater than the Levi. Because if there is, then you should call the Yisrael first. And then you shouldn't call the Levi at all. And to call Levi for number 3 or 4 in place of Yisrael, some people say it's okay, and some people say it's not okay. And we're going to learn about this in a moment in halacha number 10, that in many of these countries we don't call a Kohen or a Levi except for the final aliyah, which I just mentioned a moment ago, okay, or for the maftir, okay, because then nobody cares. And for meaning that we've already called 7, and so this guy would be number 8, or you're doing the quote-unquote 8th aliyah as maftir, meaning he's the guy who's going to be responsible for the haftarah. Okay, and so we say when you call him, which is between calling a Yisrael instead of a Kohen and a Levi, then you should say the words bimkom Kohen. Okay, that's halacha vav. Let's go to halacha zayin. Okay, number 7. If the Kohen and the Levi are in the shul, and you call the Kohen, and you didn't know the Levi was in the shul. Okay, so it's a fact that the Levi is in the shul, but the Gabbai didn't know that he was in the shul. And the Kohen starts to say the second blessing, you also don't pause him in that case either. Okay? Why? So it's the same thing. He already said the words Baruch Atah Hashem, explains the Mishnah Berurah, but Baruch Hu doesn't matter. Have the Levi come up and say Baruch Hu. Okay? And you don't need the Kohen to wait for him to finish reading. Okay? Or the Kohen doesn't need to wait. Or the Kohen does not need to stand up there and wait. Okay? Unlike what we just said. Because he's not going to do the third aliyah like the case of the Yisrael. Okay? And everything in this rule is similar to the rule we just learned. Okay. Halacha 8. If there's no Levi in the shul, the Kohen that is called first also says the second blessing. And you say, Bimkom Levi, that you say he's in place of the Levi. But you cannot call a second Kohen, so that way people won't say that the first one is something wrong with them. Okay? So the Mishnah Berurah says, why not a second Kohen? He says, this is so too, you also shouldn't call a regular Yisrael in place of the Levi, so that way people shouldn't say that the first guy is not a Kohen. All right? Stick with the pattern. Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. No more, no less. All right? Otherwise, people are going to make assumptions, like he's not a real Kohen, or the Levi, something wrong with the Levi, or this guy is a Levi. Okay? We don't want people to think that. So we say that the first guy would be not a good Kohen. So, here's the interesting problem, which we'll see in a second, is that we could assume that either one of them could be problematic, and that's why we're not calling a Kohen and a Levi at this time. So, even if we know who they are and who their families are, nonetheless, with the first one, that by making this error, you're going to make a statement by calling him based on his father, that maybe his father, we know the father would be a Kohen, but maybe the father did an oopsie and married a divorced woman, okay, or maybe the woman the wife was unfaithful to him and became impermitted to hit, and he still had a child with her anyway, right? Not allowed for a Kohen, right? So if she cheats, she must leave, she must go out, and so therefore that would preclude the children from being considered holy for the kahuna. And therefore, you must call another Kohen. So that's why you know calling 2 Kohanim in a row. Okay? However, if you call him second, they're not going to make that mistake. Because you wouldn't call a non-kosher Kohen, which is called a halal, you wouldn't call him in place of a Levi. And so that wouldn't be part of the consideration. And the Mishnah Berurah says, and in fact, many people write that even on a fast day, when the Levi isn't fasting, the Kohen should say the blessing in the place of the Levi and not call Yisrael, okay? Because that's how worried we are about people making oopsies and drawing conclusions about people's lineage, and so therefore it's better just to simply follow that pattern of let the Kohen go twice. Okay, halacha 9. This is test. Two Leviim should not go one after the other, in order that people will not say that one of the Leviim are also no good. Okay, so same thing. So even though the Mishnah explains that even though we know who their fathers are, maybe the father married a woman who was a mamzeres or a nesina, right? Or some other form of improper lineage type person, and that precluded this child from being a Levi. Okay, and so even though if he's a mamzer, he can still get an aliyah, but he gets an aliyah as Yisrael, right? Yisrael mamzer, but not as a Levi. That was 9. Number 10. So here's an interesting thing. He says over here that the custom is to call a Kohen after a Kohen if Yisrael was called up between them. Okay? And the Chazan should the person who's the Gabbai, right, who's up there calling people up. And we say the same thing by a Levi, that if you put a Levi in between. So this is when you have more than the 3 that you have on a regular weekday. Okay, so that's Shulchan Aruch brings down. The Ramah adds, it's permitted, therefore it is permitted, to have a Levi come for maftir, or a Kohen go for maftir, in this fashion, right? Because everybody else it's Yisrael all the way down. And if you just say maftir and don't make any other mentions about it, then you don't have anything to worry about people saying, oh, he's not a Kohen, oh, he's not a Levi, because you're going to mention his name, right? Yena ben Yena HaKohen, Yena ben Yena HaLevi, right? And some people say that we don't do that. We don't call a Kohen or a Levi to be part of the 7 on a Shabbos, but after the 7, you could call a Kohen or a Levi. Okay, and he quotes that in the names of other poskim, such as the Rabbeinu Yehonasan and the Agur, and the Rabbeinu Yerucham, okay, who are all Ashkenazi poskim. And so the custom has developed in these countries of Ashkenaz, according to the Ramah. However, in a place of a real need or in a sticky situation, one could rely on the first opinion, okay, which is to put a Kohen after a Kohen if there's Yisrael in the middle. Okay, so what does that mean, putting Yisrael in the middle? The Mishnah explains. So I call the normal order, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. Okay, those are the first 3. Then I could go ahead and call a Kohen. And if there's not a Levi, I could have the Kohen come twice and then call Yisrael. That's also permitted at that point to then call a Kohen after that, right? So Kohen, 2 aliyahs, Yisrael, another Kohen. And it's also permitted to call a Kohen for as many aliyahs as you want. Okay? And so even more so for after the first 7 are done, and this is the final one. Or you're done and you're ready for Haftarah and you're calling them for Maftir. Because no one is going to worry about what you're going to say about the first ones, because we've already finished the first ones. So people would have made a big stink about it within the first 3, but not after that. And especially you're informing them of what the practice is that's going on after this. And that's why you would have, and if it were a problem, you would have called somebody else in his place. Okay? And you wouldn't have waited to call him after Yisrael either. And that's why calling them here, when you call them so-and-so HaLevi or so-and-so HaKohen, no one's going to think that they have some improper lineage issues, because you're calling them Levi. Okay, and so that's you're fixed. So that we're meeting 2 conditions. Number 1, the first 3 are normal, and everything after that, you're also calling him Kohen and Levi. And so now the Mishnah Berurah addresses the Ramah. Okay, and he says the following. Oh, sorry, no, this is still the Mechaber. So in the custom quoted by the Mechaber, he says and this is the custom. And the Lavush, which is he's a student of the Ramah, he writes that at this point in history, we don't have a custom to call anyone for the last aliyah. We don't have a custom to call anyone except for the last aliyah, and so too for maftir. And that opinion seems to be pretty standardized across all later authorities. And the Lavush explains because the last one, no one's going to assume a problem, because everyone says that the last one is considered a really important one. We call it ha'acharon, and so therefore we know that we only give it to important people. And so therefore, since we know it's the one that's finishing off the parsha, and we're giving it to an important person in the community, no one's going to have issues with that person. Okay? And we know we're going to call him off here afterwards, but we make such a big deal about this final aliyah number. It's really number 8 in the count of things. And we put a break between it and the guy who's going to read Haftarah. Okay? We're going to say Kaddish. And so everyone's like, this must mean it's really important. And also the maftir, they also don't care if that person's a Kohen, because it's like a new thing that they're reading, right? It's a new big deal. Okay? And so if the Achron was a Kohen and the maftir was a Kohen, we also don't worry about it because of that pause in the middle with the Kaddish. So that's the statement of Lavush quoted in the Mishnah Berurah. So that's what it says. Now, the Mishnah Berurah says the following. In a place of need, such as you have 2 chasanim, right? 2 guys are getting married that week. And they have the groomsmen, all right? And everyone is a bunch of Kohanim, right? It's a big Kohen family amongst both of them. And they have a bunch of Phanim Levium. So then you can split up the parsha into 2. So for the first half, you call 7 people for that, okay? And then you call the chasan at the beginning of the second half, and then call all of his buddies. Okay, that's the Mishnah Berurah solution. And he says, and later authority is right, that on Simchas Torah, when we take out all the Sifrei Torah, which is like 3, for many places just have 3, then you could do 3 Kohanim after Chasan Torah and after Chasan Bereshis. Okay, 1 for Chasan Torah, 1 for Chasan Bereshis, and 1 for Maftir. Because they're from different Svarim, and it's also, everything's in different spots. So he says those could all 3 be Kohanim. On Rosh Chodesh Teves, that's on Shabbos, which is also in the middle of Hanukkah, and you take out 3 Sifrei Torah, okay? And there's also, right, so in that case too, you could follow the same rule, because then for the first book, you're going to read the end of the Parsha Shavua, and in the second book, you're going to read Rosh Chodesh, and the third one, you're going to read about Hanukkah. Okay? And so that's what he says you could do that. However, we don't call the Kohen, we don't do that, a Kohen in that case. Okay? Because that's still the first aliyah is considered part of the 7. We haven't finished the first 7. So having a separate book doesn't count because you also have to meet the condition of finishing the first 7. Okay? And also, in this other book, you're going to read Rosh Chodesh. And then there's the other book where you're going to be you're going to read about Hanukkah. Okay? That, you could call a Kohen for it. Okay? So, and the Kohen for Maftir would be fine. Another example would be for Parshas Shekalim, or Parshas HaChodesh, which are the days leading up, the Shabbos and leading up to Pesach, that you're going to have 3 Sifrei Torah at those times as well. This same rule would apply. Don't call a Kohen for the middle Sefer Torah. And to finish off the seven aliyahs that are required on that Shabbos. Okay, only on the last two books could you do that. Okay, for the added one and for the maftir. And he says this is from the Shari Ephraim. Okay. And so he gives other examples about Prima Gadim, from the Prima Gadim about Chol Moed Sukkos, but it's more than we're going to get into right now. Now, the Ramah brings down that in a moment of urgency, okay, that you could rely on the Mechaber's opinion. Okay, and so when is that? So the Shulchan Aruch the Mishnah brings down that the Shulchan Aruch's opinion is perfectly fine in Simchas Torah and that type of situation. So once you call three people, then you can call Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. You can call whoever you want to, Kohen or Levi, whatever. Okay, that's what the Mechaber holds. So even if you want to rely on the first opinion, nonetheless, there are many people who disagree with relying on the Beis Yosef's opinion at all. Anyway, and you should not call Kohen and Levi anywhere in the reading, unless you do a new order from the beginning, which is Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. So you do Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, then Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, then Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, and then do a bunch of Yisraels to fill in. Okay, and then there's no concern about. Then we've satisfied every opinion, and no one's going to worry about anybody else because they're not going to say, "Oh, he's not really a Kohen, he's not really this, he's not really that," without making a normal order of things. Okay. And so, therefore, according to this opinion, even the last person in the maftir shouldn't be a Kohen and a Levi, except for the fact that the minhag is that we already do these type of things. Okay, so even though this opinion disagrees with the one we already cited, we've accepted kind of both a little bit. So it's worthwhile to be strict for Simchas Torah, but in general, for the Acharon and for the maftir, we can be lenient and allow you to call a Kohen and a Levi. Okay. And so therefore, so just kind of recap that. So on a regular week, they always Kohen Levi Yisrael. On a Shabbos, there's a machlokes between the Ramah and the Mechaber as to after you finish the first three, can you make the next four of them a Kohen, a Levi, and Yisrael? According to Mechaber, if you put a Yisrael in the middle, you can then call another Kohen. So you can go Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, and then call another Kohen, and then call Yisrael, and then call a Levi, and then call Yisrael. Right? Or you could finish all seven, and the Acharon will be number 8 could be a Kohen or a Levi, because there's a Yisrael in the middle. And for Maftir, you could also call whoever you want. Except according to the first opinion of the Mechaber, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. If you're reading a different Sefer Torah, the Mishnah Berurah says that there would be room to be lenient in those cases. Okay? But the minhag is not to do any of that. Unless it's a time of great need. So there was the option to basically break up the reading into two lanings to do that. And I got this, as stupid as it sounds, this question comes up all the time about how to do it. So that's an important one to kind of know. Let's see. Can we get one more in here? Yeah, let's get number 11 in here. All right. There's an opinion that says that if you call up a Kohen, right? So the Chazan calls up a Kohen, or he calls up a Levi, and he's not there. Don't call up another guy by their name, because that's going to make it bad for the other person. Okay? Just somebody just comes up and just recites the bracha. Okay? And that's our custom. The Ramah says that the Shliach Sibor, who's a Kohen, he could call a Kohen, another Kohen to the Torah. Okay, so that's fine. So as long as it doesn't always have to be him. So the Mishnah Berurah explains a Kohen or Levi, but for Yisrael, if you call him up and he's not there, you can call another Yisrael because there's no problem with that. Okay, so because anybody can come up, even a person who's a mamzer, so that's not a problem. And we'll discuss this again in chapter 282:3. We say he's not there. Okay, what does that mean? So the Mishnah Berurah explains that if it's the Kohen who's davening, then you can call up somebody else because everyone realizes that he's there and still davening. Okay, so that person you can actually say their name. And we say the reason because you're going to ruin their lineage. And the Mishnah Berurah explains there, people are going to think that after the minute you call them up, you're like, "Oi, he's no good." So later authority is right that nonetheless, his son you can call up, and you can use his name. Because if there was a problem, you would call up the son. So you're going to think that maybe the problem was that maybe he's not there. I'll think of something else. Okay? So that would be an exception to the rule. And so we say that he just shows up without being called. So the book Shari Ephraim states the following. If you call a Kohen or a Levi for the last Aliyah, meaning it's not the first 7, but it's number 8, or you call him for Maftir, and he's not there, and you call up another person, even though the other person is a Kohen or the other person is a Levi, you can actually use his name even though you're replacing him with another person, because there's no concern about Pagam Mishpacha in this case. Okay? Because even a regular Jew can be called up. So the whole point is whether or not calling up another name is going to create an issue in their lineage. And the last thing we learn about is that a Kohen, who's the leader of the congregation, can call up anybody. Okay? And we're not worried that he's going to ruin himself by calling up another Kohen, because everyone knows that he's calling him up because he's busy, right? He's busy leading the congregation. So they're going to say, listen, it's just because this guy's the big Kohen doesn't mean that no other Kohen in the world can get an Aliyah because he's here. Okay, and that not calling up is not going to make us assume that he's not worthy of the title of Kohen. And so even if the second command is also a Kohen, and he's the one who actually does all the calling up, he can also go up a Kohen. Okay, and especially where people are selling the Aliyahs, okay, and you buy it, and he's a Kohen or a Levi, he can go ahead and say, I want to be called as Kohen or Levi for this time. And there's no problem to call up somebody in your place, even though you yourself are a Kohen or a Levi, because you're trying to honor somebody else. All right, thank you for joining. We're gonna next week will be a fun theoretical proposition with the whole city's Kohanim. This is a really fun halakha. We'll pick it up with number 12 next time. As we plow through, and we'll finish up the section next week about learning Kriyas Torah. Okay? And so we will press on. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.